Not everybody gets to see this. It's a depiction of the Ascension, and as I was looking at the gospel today, do you see his feet? Made me smile. So, dear friends, before I had the title father, I had the title uncle. I have 14 nieces and nephews, and the running joke in my family is, do we call you Uncle Father or Father Uncle? So being a rather large family, we have a lot of different stories, and there's a story that I would like to share with all of you this morning. So one of my nephews, when he was a little kid, he was a huge Superman fan. And so he would always try to wrestle with his dad because he didn't yet realize that Dad was letting him win. So one time after my brother made my nephew cry during one of these wrestling matches, he comes back into the living room wearing his Superman blanket tied around his neck as a cape. And he's doing one of those poses, you know? And so he proceeds to tell my brother that he's the man of steel and you can't hurt me now. And then the attack ensued. An attack that even Lex Luthor would be proud of. And so my nephew attacked my brother, and once again, at the end of the battle, my nephew went away crying after his dad forced him into submission. And as my nephew walked back to his room, he was pouting, and his dad yelled, "Are you sure you're not the man of squeal?" So my nephew, he knows that Superman can't be beaten. Superman had a little bit of everything at his disposal. He has X-ray vision. He can make laser beams shoot out of his eyes to melt through things. He was stronger than a locomotive, faster than a speeding bullet, and able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. But I think the most famous of all of his attributes was his ability to fly. Now, this is all compounded by the fact that he paraded around town in disguise. So Superman was Clark Kent, right? His alter ego was a quiet, unassuming reporter who wore glasses, and he came across as being someone shy. So you would never think that this reporter was actually Superman. But the minute trouble reared its ugly head, Clark Kent would disappear into the closest phone booth, and he would reemerge as Superman. And when Superman came onto the scene, every neck would be crying to as far back as they would go. Everybody's mouth is open, and they're pointing fingers to the sky where Superman was coming to save the day and capture the evil villain. Well, friends, I have a lot of trouble believing in certain things, like people running faster than a speeding bullet, or they can see through solid objects, or that they're stronger than a locomotive. And to me, it seems highly unlikely that people can fly and disappear into the clouds without the assistance of Southwest Airlines, with using only a simple phrase, up, up, and away, right? And yet, we hear in our scriptures today the account of the ascension, of Jesus rising to the heavens. When he had said this, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him from their sight. And while they were looking intently at the sky as he was going, suddenly 2 men dressed in white garments stood beside them. We hear these words in our first reading. And so, friends, I'm sure some of you, like me, have some trouble wrapping my mind around this particular account. And I've heard many expressions for the ascension, and the one that resonates well with me is the following. I had a teacher one time who said that where Jesus went, according to tradition, was to return to the presence of God the Father in heaven. And he didn't so much go up as he went beyond. And he went beyond what he did he went beyond, and he went there to do was to finish what he began with us. And so it wasn't enough that through him, God was born into the world. We call that the gift of Christmas. But the gift of the ascension was that through him, the body of the world was taken back to God. Are you all with me? Yeah? So basically, the ascension gift was Jesus going back to heaven, body, blood, soul, divinity. He kept his humanness. So by presenting his own risen body to be seated at the right hand of God, Jesus imported flesh and blood into the holy realm of heaven for the first time. He restores the goodness of creation. And by ascending bodily into heaven, he showed us that flesh and blood are good. Humanity is good. It is good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for heaven, it's good enough for God. And so by putting on flesh and blood and keeping them on, Jesus not only brought God to us, he has also brought us to God. And so this is as good of an explanation for the ascension as I've heard, but even then it's still a little bit abstract, especially when relating this miraculous event to our day-to-day experiences. Because ultimately today we are here and Jesus is there. So almost everything else that happened to Jesus, it makes sense in terms of our own lived experiences. He was born to a human mother. So were we. He ate, he drank, he slept, he laughed, right? He took a nap, right? We'd all do that. And when he died and rose again, even that miraculous event, we can kind of relate to. We've all experienced the sadness and the heartache of death. And in those moments, we can find joy and love, even in the midst of sorrow. But ascending into heaven, to be seated at the right hand of God, is this where we part ways? Is this where we are left in the dust? When we look at this gospel account, or the account that we find in our first reading, our only experience of the ascension, friends, is from the ground. With our necks cranked as far back as they will go, with our mouths open, with our fingers pointing, looking to the heavens. We're looking for Jesus somewhere in the heavens. And we inevitably find ourselves standing there with the disciples, looking up into heaven with our feet firmly planted on solid earth. And so the disciples, they stood there in shock for a moment, looking toward heaven, trying to figure out where Jesus went and what all this means. And their trance was broken by two men dressed in white asking, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven?" I think those two men dressed in white were sent to remind Jesus' friends that if they wanted to see him again, it was no use looking up. Better that they should look around instead. Looking around at each other. Looking around at the world that they lived in. The ordinary people in their ordinary lives, because that is now where they were most likely to encounter Jesus. Not in the way that they used to know him, but in a new way. Not in his own body, but in their bodies. The risen Lord, the ascended Lord, was no longer anywhere on earth, so he could be everywhere instead. So no one standing around watching the disciples that day could have guessed what an astounding thing happened when they stopped looking into the sky and started to look around. Because on the surface, friends, this wasn't a very incredible moment. We have 11 abandoned disciples with virtually nothing to show for the last few years of their life together. But in the time that followed, it became quite apparent that something amazing was happening. Those 11 people consented to become the church, and because of that, nothing has ever been the same since. These followers became leaders. Listeners became preachers. Converts became missionaries. The healed became healers. The disciples became apostles and witnesses of the risen Lord by the power of the Holy Spirit. And friends, nothing was ever the same. Now, this isn't probably the way that the disciples would have planned it. They probably would have kept Jesus there with them so they could find him, so they would know where he is, so they could rely on him forever. But the Word made flesh could not be contained in a body forever. So Jesus went away, and they stood looking up toward heaven, and then they stopped looking up, and they started looking around. They looked around at each other, and they got to the business of being church. And once they did that, surprising things began to happen. They began to say things that sounded like him. They began to do things that no one had ever done but him before. And whenever 2 or 3 gathered in his name, it was always as if there was someone else in the room with them, whom they couldn't see. But yet there was this strong, abiding presence of the absent one, available to them under the appearance of bread and wine. Body, blood, soul, divinity. And that was just as familiar to them as each other's faces. And nothing has been the same since. And so, friends, you know that Clark Kent, he was so normal, he was so ordinary. Nothing in his appearance made him really stand out as Superman, and yet this average Joe reporter had such special powers that he could literally save the world. And in many ways, the disciples were not much more than average guys. They themselves were ordinary reporters sharing with the world this account of an incredible Galilean named Jesus. And they didn't look like superheroes. There wasn't a giant Hebrew letter on their chest as they went up, up, and away. They couldn't fly. But when they stopped looking up and started looking around and looking outward, that's when they changed the world. And my friends, we have that same mission. And so, why do you stand here looking up toward heaven?